Imagine being 7 years old. You wake up before sunrise, put on your uniform, and walk to school in the cold. You're hungry because breakfast was nothing but a small piece of bread. You sit down at your wooden desk, your back perfectly straight, your hands folded, your eyes forward. You don't speak unless spoken to. You don't move unless told to. And if you make a single mistake, if you spell a word wrong, if you fidget, if you look out the window for just 1 second too long, a grown adult walks over to you, tells you to hold out your hand, and hits you as hard as they can with a thick wooden cane. And everyone in the room, including you, thinks this is completely normal. This was the reality of going to school in Victorian England. And tonight we're going to find out exactly why. Not just what happened inside those classrooms, but the real reason behind it. The deeper forces that made beating children not just acceptable, but considered absolutely essential to their education. Welcome back. Today we're talking about Victorian schools, what they really were, who ran them, what happened inside them every single day, and why an entire society convinced itself that hitting children was the kindest thing you could do for them. Let's start from the very beginning. When Queen Victoria took the throne in 1837, England had no national education system whatsoever. There was no law that said children had to go to school. There was no government department overseeing education. There was no standard curriculum, no teacher training, no inspections, no rules. If a child got an education, it was entirely down to luck. The luck of being born into a wealthy family, or the luck of living near a church that happened to run a small school for the poor. For the vast majority of English children in the early Victorian period, schools simply didn't exist. They worked. They helped their parents in the fields, or in the markets, or increasingly in the factories and mines that were spreading across the country like a dark tide. Education was a luxury. Survival was the priority. But as the Victorian era progressed, something began to change. The Industrial Revolution was creating a new kind of society, one that needed not just strong backs, but organized minds. Factories needed workers who could follow written instructions. Railways needed clerks who could read timetables and write reports. The expanding British Empire needed administrators who could manage colonies thousands of miles away. Suddenly, literacy and numeracy weren't just nice to have. They were economically essential. And so, for the first time in English history, politicians began to seriously discuss the idea of educating the masses. The first major step came in 1870 with the Elementary Education Act, sometimes called the Forster Act after the politician who introduced it. This law didn't make school compulsory immediately, but it did something revolutionary. It created a network of publicly funded schools, called board schools, that would be available to all children, regardless of their background or their parents' ability to pay. For the first time, the government was accepting responsibility for educating ordinary children. Compulsory attendance came in 1880, when a new law required all children between 5 and 10 to attend school. And by 1891, education was made free for most children, removing the small fees that had still been a barrier for the very poorest families. On paper, this sounds like tremendous progress, and in many ways it was. But here's where the story gets complicated. Because the people who built this new education system, the people who decided what schools would look like and how they would operate, brought with them a very particular set of beliefs about children, about learning, and about discipline. And those beliefs would shape the experience of millions of children for generations to come. To understand Victorian attitudes toward school discipline, you first have to understand Victorian attitudes toward children themselves. The Victorians had a deeply ambivalent relationship with childhood. On one hand, the era produced some of the most sentimental depictions of childhood in all of human history. Charles Dickens wrote heartbreaking stories about innocent children suffering in a cruel world. The pre-Raphaelite painters created glowing, angelic images of childhood innocence. Queen Victoria herself was famously devoted to her 9 children and helped create the modern idea of the family as a warm, nurturing unit centered on the home. But underneath all that sentimentality ran a much darker current. The Victorians also believed, deeply, sincerely, almost universally, that children were fundamentally flawed. not just inexperienced or immature, but morally compromised from birth. This belief came directly from Protestant Christianity, which taught that all human beings were born in a state of original sin. Children, with their natural tendencies towards selfishness, laziness, disobedience, and dishonesty, were seen as living proof of this doctrine. The job of parents, teachers, and society was not to nurture a child's natural goodness. It was to suppress their natural badness, to beat the sin out of them, quite literally, before it could take root and grow into adult vice and criminality. This wasn't considered cruel. This was considered love. The Victorian parent or teacher who refused to discipline a child harshly was seen not as kind, but as negligent, as someone who was allowing a child to be destroyed by their own worst impulses. The book of Proverbs said it plainly, "Spare the rod and spoil the child." And the Victorians took that seriously. Now let's walk inside a Victorian school and see exactly what this looked like in practice. The physical environment of a Victorian school was designed deliberately and consciously to teach obedience before it taught anything else. Classrooms were arranged so that every child faced forward toward the teacher at all times. Desks were fixed to the floor so they couldn't be moved. Children sat in rows, perfectly aligned, with no possibility of turning to speak to a neighbor without being immediately visible to the teacher at the front. The teacher stood on a raised platform, sometimes only a few inches high, sometimes much more, so that they could see every child in the room simultaneously. This wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. The teacher was above, the children were below. The hierarchy was built into the very architecture of the room. Silence was the default state of a Victorian classroom. Children did not speak unless directly addressed by the teacher. They did not ask questions. They did not express opinions. They did not show confusion or struggle. Learning in the Victorian model was not a conversation. It was a transmission. The teacher had knowledge. The children were empty vessels. The teacher's job was to pour knowledge in, and the children's job was to receive it without resistance. And what happened when a child resisted? When they fidgeted, or forgot a lesson, or talked out of turn, or arrived late, or simply failed to perform as expected, they were beaten. The primary instrument of punishment in Victorian schools was the cane, a thin, flexible rod, usually made from wrought tan, that was kept at the front of every classroom. Teachers were trained in its use. There were even informal guidelines about technique, how to hold it, how to swing it, where to strike. The hands were the most common target, specifically the palm, held flat and outstretched. But strokes to the back of the legs, the backside, and even the back itself were not unusual, particularly for older boys. Girls were generally caned less frequently than boys, not out of compassion, but out of a complex set of Victorian ideas about femininity and propriety. For girls, humiliation was often considered a more appropriate punishment than physical pain. Being made to stand in front of the class, being given a dunce cap to wear, being kept behind after school. These are punishments specifically designed to shame rather than hurt. Though it should be said that many female teachers and many schools that accepted girls used the cane just as freely as any boys' school. Beyond the cane, Victorian teachers had a remarkable arsenal of punishments at their disposal. Children could be made to stand in a corner for hours, holding heavy books outstretched at arm's length. They could be forced to write the same sentence hundreds of times, a punishment we still reference today when we talk about writing lines. They could be made to kneel on hard wooden floors for extended periods. They could be denied food, kept in after school in the dark, or made to stand outside in cold weather. And for the most serious offenses, serious by Victorian standards, which meant things like persistent truancy, cheating, or what teachers called impertinence, meaning any form of talking back, there was the birch. A bundle of thin twigs tied together. The birch was more severe than the cane and was usually reserved for boys. Its use required the headmaster's approval in most schools, which was the closest thing to a safeguard that existed. Because here is the crucial point. There were almost no legal limits on how teachers could physically punish children. The concept of reasonable chastisement, which had long applied to parents, also applied to teachers. As long as the punishment wasn't so severe as to cause lasting injury, it was entirely legal. Teachers could not be prosecuted. Parents could not sue. Children had no legal recourse whatsoever. And this brings us to something very important that is rarely discussed in the history of Victorian education: the class dimension of school punishment. Not all Victorian schools were the same. The experience of a child attending an elite public school. And remember that in Britain, public school means the opposite of what it means in America, referring to expensive private boarding schools like Eton, Harrow, and Winchester, was completely different from the experience of a child at a board school in the East End of London. At the great public schools, corporal punishment was not just permitted. It was ritualized. It was formal. It had its own elaborate traditions and customs that had developed over centuries. At Eton, boys could be flogged by the headmaster for a range of offenses, and this was considered not just acceptable, but character building. The boys would go on to run the British Empire, to govern colonies, to command armies, were being toughened up. Being beaten in this context was almost a mark of distinction. You had been through it, and you had survived, and that made you stronger. There was also, at the public schools, a system of institutionalized bullying that was so embedded it had its own name and its own rules. Fagging was the practice by which younger boys were required to act as personal servants for older boys, cleaning their rooms, polishing their shoes, running their errands. And older boys had the right to physically punish younger boys who failed in these duties. This wasn't hidden or shameful. It was official school policy. It was considered excellent preparation for the hierarchies of adult life. At the board schools attended by working-class children, punishment was less ritualized but no less frequent and often much more arbitrary. Working-class children faced teachers who were frequently exhausted, underpaid, and managing classrooms of 60, 70, or even 80 children simultaneously. The cane wasn't just a tool of moral instruction in these schools. It was a crowd control mechanism. It was how one adult maintained order over a room full of hungry, tired, sometimes traumatized children who had no particular reason to sit still and learn their multiplication tables. Log books, diaries kept by Victorian head teachers recording the daily life of their schools, survive in archives across England and give us a vivid picture of just how routinely violence was used. Entry after entry records canings administered for offenses that today would not even register as misconduct. A boy caned for losing his pencil. A girl kept in for arriving 2 minutes late. A child beaten for not knowing the answer to a question that had apparently been covered the previous week when he was absent sick. The children themselves had almost no voice in any of this. They could not complain to authorities. They could not expect their parents to intervene. Most working-class Victorian parents considered school discipline entirely the teacher's domain, and many actively encouraged harsh punishment, believing it would toughen their children up for the difficult lives that lay ahead. Some parents were reported to have gone to schools specifically to thank teachers for beating their children particularly hard. But here's what makes this story even more complex. Not all Victorian educators agreed with this system. There were dissenting voices, people who looked at the evidence and reached a very different conclusion about how children actually learned. Johann Heinrich Pestalozzi, a Swiss educator whose ideas were widely read in Victorian England, argued that children learned best through kindness, encouragement, and hands-on experience rather than rote repetition and fear. Friedrich Froebel, the German educator who invented the kindergarten, believed that children's natural curiosity and playfulness were not flaws to be suppressed, but gifts to be cultivated. These ideas did penetrate Victorian education, slowly and partially. Some progressive schools, particularly those run by Quakers and other nonconformist religious groups, became known for their relatively gentle approach to discipline. And as the Victorian era progressed, a small but growing chorus of voices began to argue publicly that beating children was not just ineffective but actively harmful. A remarkable woman named Frances Power Cobbe wrote extensively in the 1870s about the damage caused by violent discipline in schools and homes. She gathered evidence, wrote pamphlets, gave lectures, and lobbied politicians. She was largely ignored at the time, but she was planting seeds. The medical profession also began, very gradually, to raise concerns. Doctors started documenting cases of children who showed signs of what we would today recognize as trauma: persistent anxiety, inability to concentrate, bedwetting, nightmares, in connection with harsh school discipline. These observations were tentative and often buried in medical journals that most people never read. But they represented the beginning of a shift in understanding that would eventually transform education entirely. By the 1890s and into the early 20th century, public debate about school punishment was becoming more visible. Newspapers began running stories about particularly egregious cases: teachers who had gone too far, children who had been seriously injured, incidents that even Victorian standards recognized as excessive. A small number of teachers were dismissed for their conduct. A very small number faced legal consequences. Change was agonizingly slow. Corporal punishment in British state schools was not actually banned until 1986, nearly a century after the Victorian era ended. In private schools, the ban didn't come until 1998 in England and Wales, 2000 in Scotland, and 2003 in Northern Ireland. The last echoes of the Victorian classroom took an extraordinarily long time to fade. So what does all of this tell us? The beating of children in Victorian schools wasn't random cruelty. It wasn't the product of individual sadistic teachers, though there were certainly those. It was the logical expression of a coherent set of beliefs about children, about learning, about morality, and about the purpose of education itself. The Victorians believed that children were born flawed, that discipline was love, that obedience was the foundation of all learning, and that the body could be used to teach the soul. These beliefs were so deeply embedded in their culture, their religion, and their social structures that almost nobody questioned them. The teachers who beat their students every day were not monsters. Most of them genuinely believed they were doing right by those children. Most of them had been beaten themselves by teachers who also believed they were doing right. This is perhaps the most unsettling part of the whole story. Not the cruelty. Cruelty is easy to condemn from a distance. What's unsettling is how convinced everyone was that it was right. How a whole society, full of people who loved their children and wanted the best for them, built a system of organized violence and called it education. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? What systems are we building today, with complete conviction that we're doing the right thing, that people 100 years from now will look back on with the same horror we feel looking at Victorian classrooms? That's a question worth sitting with. Thanks for watching. If this video made you think, please subscribe, because there's a lot more Victorian history coming very soon. And let me know in the comments, what part of this surprised you the most? Because I have a feeling the answer is going to be different for everyone.
Yes, face all. Into lost. Embark free.